Welcome to the IISS this afternoon. My name is Rahul Roy Chaudhary. I'm the Senior Fellow for South Asia at the Institute and the head of the South Asia program. Today's talk and discussion session is on the diplomatic dimension of India's maritime challenges. And I think that this talk could not have come at a better time in terms of what I personally see as one of 3 or 4 key shifts of the new Modi government in terms of its foreign and security policy, where for the first time my sense is that the Indian government actually perceives the Indian Ocean as the country's immediate and extended neighborhood. The first visit outside Delhi for the new Prime Minister in 2014 was, interestingly, to go aboard India's largest warship, the modernized ex-Russian aircraft carrier Vikramaditya, off the Goa coast soon after he was sworn in. The Prime Minister of India has also visited island states in the Indian Ocean, 3 of them, Seychelles, Mauritius and Sri Lanka. A visit to the Maldives was cancelled at the last moment. And unusually for a foreign Indian Prime Minister, we've seen that for the first time in decades, Prime Minister Modi unveiled a 4-pronged vision for the Indian Ocean, which he unveiled during his visit to Mauritius in March. This is the first vision statement on the Indian Ocean by any Indian Prime Minister in decades. This vision statement focuses on defending India's maritime territory and interests, deepening economic and security cooperation with maritime neighbors, promoting collective action for peace and security, and seeking a more integrated and cooperative future for sustainable development. So clearly, the maritime dimension of India's security, I suspect, is going to get greater focus within this government. I'm delighted, therefore, that we have with us Ambassador Yogendra Kumar, who is the former Ambassador of India to the Philippines and Tajikistan and High Commissioner to Namibia. Ambassador Kumar joined the Indian Foreign Service in 1977 and had several postings abroad, including in London several years ago, and served also as a senior directing staff member at India's National Defence College. Ambassador Kumar has actually also just published a book on this subject, and he's kindly agreed to speak to us for about 25 minutes, after which there'll be a discussion session. So over to you, Ambassador.
Thank you, Mr. Roy Chaudhary. Ladies and gentlemen, I feel truly honored to speak at this very prestigious, internationally renowned think tank on the subject of my book, which is Diplomatic Dimension of Maritime Challenges for India in the 21st Century. I left some flyers on the table so that during my professional career, I've come to rely on the quality and depth of the IOSS publications, and I used to be a frequent attendee at the various events here during my days in London. My thanks to you, Mr. Roy Chaudhary, for whose redoubtable expertise on naval and maritime issues, especially Indian, is internationally acknowledged. I also thank our High Commissioner and our Naval Advisor who's here for the help in making this event possible. And I will thank you all very much for taking your time out to come to this discussion and for your interest in India. And I can see some of my old friends here, which is truly a delight. The purpose of writing this little somewhat anecdotal book is to examine the current maritime issues of concern and interest to India from the point of view of a former diplomat, unburdened by official constraints, and perhaps to indulge in a little freewheeling inquiry. Interest in India has grown in recent times due to its rising profile and the aggravated relations amongst the big powers. Its potential role is being analyzed from their respective points of view and interests. India's own interests have grown in different water bodies, unlike the previous decades, because, as I said, its profile is rising, and also because there is a fallout of the aggravated tensions in different parts where India's interests are involved. And these challenges, I find that some of them are qualitatively new and even the existing challenges now appear in a transformed shape. I analyze India's interest and role in a holistic sense. I cover the Navy, the Coast Guard, whose growth has been concomitant with the UNCLOS and India's adherence to it. The Coastal Police, which actually, this growth of which was spurred by the Mumbai terror attacks of November 2008. And shipping, which is also an aspect of India's national economic and technological regeneration. And I also cover ocean affairs, the Department of Ocean Affairs, because of its relevance in terms of monsoon forecasting, modeling, climate change, exploitation of ocean resources, etc. I situate my inquiry in the context of the process of regaining India's maritime vision after the colonial period of maritime blindness. And this maritime vision even had, when it had, before it acquired the blindness, had a civilizational dimension. And I talk about that as well as the hard power imperatives in today's unstable and unpredictable world. Civilizationally, the seas have always been part of Indian society and even considered an important dimension, as I said, of a civilizational greatness. In a way, it was lost, as I mentioned earlier, and now this particular aspect of the regaining of India's maritime vision also can infuse, and we hope it will infuse, government's policy in developing its maritime footprint. The reason for this is that the very nature of the maritime challenges are now different. These challenges are described in detail in my book, but I also talk about the opportunities that become available to India and to the international community. These pressing issues affect us all and require different kind of institutional responses and impulses than those required in tackling challenges which were more in the nature of the zero-sum paradigm. Events I analyzed in the context of worsening relations, as I mentioned, between the great powers, conflating of revolution in military affairs, and the weakening of multinational and national institutions, which have aggravated both types of challenges, the traditional as well as the non-traditional security threats. And in my book, the Indian Navy remains the centerpiece of my inquiry. I situate these challenges because I do talk about the issue of the security as well as the fact that these are these transformational times, particularly the post-Cold War. And I actually here bring in, I talk about the various, the characteristics of the post-Cold War security scenario. And I bring in globalization and various aspects of that, unilateralism of the victors of the Cold War, the onset of the post-Westphalian Long War, and impact on military doctrine, the phenomenon of failed states, weakening of state institutions, emergence of new factors shaping the international security milieu, weakening of multilateral institutions, the strategic impact of global economic and financial crisis 2008, and the current phase of globalization in newly emergent states. And I also then go on to discuss the challenges of co-option of the rising powers, particularly I do bring in China in that. And the conundrum of transition to the post-Cold War. And in that context, I look at the geopolitical dynamics and how India's national security and foreign policy objectives need to be realized. Now, I actually go into some detail about this because, as I said, that in my view, as I look at the security situation, unless we understand the nature of the kind of transformation taking place, it's not very easy to develop an approach as to how they are to be addressed. And I take as a point of reference the US National Intelligence Council report, which was published in December 2012, which is projecting global trends to 2030. Basically, why I bring it up? Because it brings out the trends in the evolving security situation, the difficulties in making an analysis of the dynamics of this kind of change. And the methodological conundrums I actually highlight in my book, which actually I picked up from this National Intelligence Council report. I just want to mention them because I weave them into my narrative further when I discuss how the maritime security issues are to be tackled. And they are as follows. The conundrums, as the authors of of the Global Futures Report 2030 highlight are the following. Examination of outcomes concerning the role of the United States in the international system in the situation of its decline, or a decisive reassertion in terms of the response of the other powers. Next, inquiry into the dynamics of governance and exploration of complicated relationships among a diverse set of actors, especially the role of states versus non-state actors. Next, realization that the tendency has been to underestimate the rate of change with respect to the trajectories of the rise or decline of different states. Next, better exploration of the framework of relationships between trends, discontinuities, and crises. Next, better focus on smaller political psychosocial shifts that do not go under the umbrella of ideology, but drive behavior rather than the grand ideologies like fascism or communism. Next, better identification of looming disequilibria, more wargaming and simulation exercises to understand the possible dynamics amongst international actors at crucial tipping points. So basically, in this particular context, I do have some reflections as to what is the conundrum of these power transitions, what is the nature of political transformation, and I reflect as to why these transformations, such transformations are accompanied by so much of bloodletting and institutional fragility, and why are they so difficult to predict. And I bring that because since I reflect on this kind of a dynamic of this political transformation, particularly post-Cold War, I do bring in the experience of India as to how India achieved a political transformation based on its freedom struggle, and how that transformation 47 onwards, the enduring institutional stability, and why that experience is relevant in our context today. And I just want to bring in here a little bit of anecdote just to bring out this particular aspect. And that is, I just want to read out a small, this is a dialogue or a conversation between Mahatma Gandhi and Jawaharlal Nehru, who later on became the Prime Minister. Thank you so much. And it goes like this. And Nehru actually asked Gandhi, he said, the difference between you and me is that you believe in gradualism and I stand for revolution. This is what Nehru taunted Gandhi. And Gandhi said, my dear young man, I have made revolutions while others have only shouted revolutions. When your lungs are exhausted and you really are serious about it, you will come to me and I shall then show you how a revolution is made. Now, I think in the short presentation, a little difficult as to how I reflect on this and how I weave into weave into my narrative to see as to how we can achieve political and power transformation, which overcomes these characteristics of institutional fragility and systemic sort of fragility, which actually in a way becomes a threat multiplier. And this, of course, even more relevant, is slightly out of the scope of this particular presentation, but I bring in another one, that is his famous disciple Ghaffar Khan, and more so because of the fact that he organized the Pashtuns, the Pathans, in a non-violent kind of a force, and was able to make a transformative change in his area, considering the fact that now we contrast this particular area with so much of bloodletting and suicide belts and car bombs, so on and so forth. So the issue is that I do this because I want to, as I said, bring out the security dilemmas which are gripping the littorals of the Indian Ocean region, which are in a way the microcosm of the world as a whole. So this is my broad reflection. As I said, the broader security milieu which affects the region, the littoral, but it also affects in a way the global community, and that's why I bring in that Global Times or Global Futures report. The maritime security scenario is a subset of this larger security paradigm, which envelops the hinterland. Several maritime flashpoints I describe in my book in the various waters, which affect Indian interest. The maritime aspects of great power contestation include the Chinese Navy's constantly expanding area of operations, contextualize the task before the Indian maritime agencies, and I cover all, Navy, Coast Guard, and so on and so forth. And the accompanying hardware and doctrinal evolution, so I describe all that in my book, to examine the changing role of the various Indian maritime agencies. Now, these security challenges which exist get further complicated, and I have a chapter on that, because the mutating nature of the traditional challenges like revolution military affairs, the naval warfare, cyber warfare, space security, nuclear, biological, chemical weapons and terrorism, jihadist insurgency, piracy and armed robbery, and non-traditional security challenges, the security aspects of climate change, urbanization, littoral and maritime security, phenomenon of failed or failing states, natural disasters and pandemics. The drivers shaping these mutating challenges are the emerging Asian geopolitics and the naval rivalry in the Asia-Pacific region, where this contestation is getting even sharper, and I discussed the revised naval doctrines of various powers. This flux, unpredictability in global futures is compounded, in my view, by our overriding concerns about balance of power relationships, rather than on the declining institutional capacities of national governments. I mean, the point really is that balance of power relationship posits interaction between two states. But if the states themselves are collapsing, then what happens to the balance of power relationship? I discussed the governance mechanisms of different water bodies and Indian maritime agencies, the diplomatic engagement, and I also reflect on IR theorists, including the Indian and Chinese. I mean, how in terms of the IR theories, international relations theories, how are the Indian international relations theories are looking at global governance issues, and how are the Chinese looking at it. And also the trend amongst the Indian IR theorists, as I say, to bring the IR theory back home. That is, to in a way to let us say, to liberate it, so to say, from the Western IR theories. And I here again bring in the Gandhian IR approach, because why I say this is important is that there is let me just bring out that why I bring that out is that whilst we are all discussing these international relations theories, there is a school which is developing as to how the Gandhian approach can be applied to the international relations theories. And I quote here Professor Paul Power, University of Cincinnati, who articulates a new worldview as follows. I quote, "Externally, Gandhian teachings suggest interstate relationships based on domestic values and institutions. The international community of a Gandhian type rests on the internal nature of Gandhian politics. Social harmony is basic to this nature. The unity and agreement of social classes in their true needs and aspirations and the denial of the inevitability of class warfare are important elements of the harmony." So basically, why I bring this to, like this, is that as I see in terms of this particular conundrum that I described about the NIC report on global futures, is that I believe that the good governance, it fuses societal fault lines, and the bad governance widens them, and therefore the quality of governance and the internal configuration of the political force, which is wielding levers of state power, that actually is critical in this, and that actually also gives an idea and insight in the dynamics of what this National Intelligence Council report talks about, better understanding of smaller political psychosocial shifts. So I highlight that debate. Then I talk about the maritime, the defense and maritime system, where I discuss that in various ways, and I bring the discussion to my basic conclusion that the UNCLOS provides a workable basis for providing a stable maritime system. And in this context, I discuss the defensive system, rules of the road in the context, and I bring that discussion again to the Indian Ocean region, because here, and I come to that a little later, but my starting point really on this is that unlike the other water bodies adjacent to the Indian Ocean region, it is still largely placid, and therefore it gives us an opening and an opportunity where the defense, the maritime system can be bolstered and developed, and so can the rules of the road. And I feel and I advocate that the Indian Navy is best placed to lead the discourse because of its role and its position. Then I look into the issue of the grand strategy implications for India and the role of the Indian Navy, the Chinese Navy, or any other Navy. I discuss the expanding or the growing presence of the Chinese Navy in the Indian Ocean, and I bring in the Pakistan, China, India triangle in this as to what is the scope for Indian diplomacy in this. But I look at the Indian Ocean region security situation not just in the China context, but larger context in terms of the security of the littoral regions and how they also make an impact. And why I say this debate is necessary, the most recent example, of course, is that the Saudi Arabian Navy has captured the Perim Island in the Bab el-Mandab recently. So my inquiry leads to the basic conclusion that given the relatively placid situation in the Indian Ocean, specific attention needs to be paid to prevent the growing tensions in the East China Sea and now the South China Sea from spilling over into the Indian Ocean as a kind of self-fulfilling prophecy. The arrival of China in the Indian Ocean waters has become is a strategic and diplomatic challenge, certainly for India, but many other countries. And to achieve that, it requires major policy decisions as regards the governance mechanisms, as well as capacity building. This includes the Navy, which will be a major shaper of this effort. And the Navy also, I do talk about the Navy as the keeper of India's sea-based nuclear deterrent, and I talk about the deterrence stability vis-a-vis Pakistan and China. And the diplomacy being the first line of defense of India's interest, without overlooking the hard security dimension of the challenges that we face. And here my approach again is, and my concluding, I come to the conclusion, is that the approach actually is to foreground the handling of non-traditional security challenges in the region, which should be foregrounded in our diplomatic agenda, which is the right way to go about it because it will ameliorate or it will diminish the salience of the hard security challenges. But it also gives us a greater scope for expanding the maritime footprint, which is not in terms of sharing of skills, not apart from bolstering the maritime order in the region, in the Indian Ocean region, but also sharing of skills in terms of the naval and the Coast Guard and so on and so forth, shipping, but as well as the Department of Ocean Affairs, which actually has huge capabilities, and I bring them all out, huge capabilities in terms of providing or really in a way guiding the national effort to enable the littoral states to handle the non-traditional challenges like disasters, like better utilization of their resources, sea-based resources, ocean-based resources, and in terms of as I said, better predictions, better monsoon modeling, profiling of the climate change, and so on and so forth. And all that, if you look at that kind of an enlarged footprint, maritime footprint of India, I feel that this would be consonant with the civilizational vision of the leaders of India's freedom struggle. My policy recommendations, I talk about capacity creation, I cover all the maritime agencies. Yeah, that's it. I cover all the maritime agencies as to how their capacities need to be upscaled for this purpose. And I do also talk about the Indian Ocean Rim Association. I feel it needs to be upscaled. It needs to be at the summit level. There are some membership anomalies in that. For example, Pakistan is not a member of the Indian Ocean Rim Association. And then I link up better linkage between the Indian Ocean Rim Association, upscaling them at the summit level, bringing dialogue partners from all countries which have stakes or interests in Indian Ocean affairs, to bring them all there and then provide a more stronger link of the Indian Ocean Naval Association, which is where, again, Pakistan is a member of that, the non-participating member, but US is not a dialogue partner, for example. So I'm suggesting the creation of that kind of a framework. Then I bring in our own capacity building. I talk about the whole of the government approach, a better sort of media effort from our part to actually enlarge our presence in that sense, and talk about diplomatic capacity building. And I bring in basically on the premise that India is largely seen as a non-threatening presence in the Indian Ocean region, and therefore it gives us a good opportunity for that for this kind of diplomacy and effort actually to play its role. I do talk about the instability arising from the threat of, for example, Al-Qaeda. We discussed yesterday about Al-Zulfikar incident, and how all these things we can try and square into that. So basically, that is how I look at it, so that what we have is that we don't look at the security scenario as a zero-sum game, but as a more constructive and a holistic and a more stabilizing more stabilizing effort. And my book, I'm afraid I really have to rush through it, but that's largely my framework in which I analyze this. Thank you.
Thank you, Ambassador. I think you've provided the theoretical framework on which I hope we can build in terms of the discussion that we're looking at. But while you were speaking, I noted down sort of what I think are the four key diplomatic aspects for India's maritime perspective. The first, as you said, was UNCLOS and the diplomatic effort in terms of greater sea space and what India can do about it in that sense. But secondly, I think a very important issue of maritime borders, where today India has actually concluded maritime border agreements with all of its neighbors, including island ocean, with the exception of one, Pakistan. Yeah. And I think diplomatically, the India-Bangladesh agreement, where India accepted third-party arbitration, I think again is significant. The third aspect for me, I think, is in terms of the policy which started with the Manmohan Singh government but continues with the Modi government, which is on net security cooperation with India's island ocean, with India's the Indian Ocean island states. And I think that's again a key element of that. The fourth, I would think, would be in terms of the naval cooperation with other main countries, the major power, the US, the UK, France, naval exercises that are increasing in complexity. And the fifth and the last, to my mind, would be in terms of the diplomatic relationships where the maritime dimension comes across. And a quick example of that is the India-US joint statement on the Indian Ocean, where for the first time the South China Sea is mentioned in the joint statement, which no other Indian government would have agreed to earlier, which clearly is indication of India's growing concerns over Chinese naval presence in the Indian Ocean. The reason I list these five key aspects that I see of India's maritime diplomacy is to ask you two questions. The first question is, who exactly leads within the Indian government on defining India's maritime diplomacy? As you know, there is no jointness, or there's no sort of maritime security coordination group, for example, because of stovepiping within different ministries. So in your experience and in terms of the new government's perspectives, who do you think actually takes decisions on it? Is it the Ministry of External Affairs? Is it Joint Secretary DISA, for example? Would it be the Ministry of Defense, JSPIC? Would it be the Navy in that sense in terms of the operations? Because for very many years, having followed the Indian Navy for over 2 decades, I think my sense is the Navy has always been ahead of the government of India on naval diplomacy and on maritime security issues. It's only now that the government of India is catching up with the Navy's perspective on these. So the first question to you is, who actually leads within the Indian government or the Navy on these issues? The second question is the one that you touched upon on China. China, clearly, the biggest concern for the Indian Navy is the Chinese Navy, my sense is. But at the same time, there is an attempt to build a diplomatic relationship with the Chinese Navy. There's an attempt to have a maritime cooperation working group. There's a joint statement on that. As far as I'm aware, that maritime cooperation working group has never met, and it's unlikely to meet in that sense. But where do you think the focus of the diplomatic, political, security aspect within India lies towards China or the maritime dimension? Will India, for example, will the Modi government hold another quadrilateral naval exercise, bringing together India, the US, Australia, Japan, and Singapore, which was held several years ago, but after Chinese démarche, Delhi and other countries decided that wasn't the way forward. Do you think this government will actually carry out a quadrilateral naval exercise? Thank you. And then we'll open it up for discussion.
Sure, right, thank you. I think these are very valid and relevant questions. However, as I mentioned in my book, the scope of my sort of inquiries is much broader, because I bring in the entire issue as to how we can create systemic institutional stability in the littoral countries. What are the ways of doing that? I suggested a basic approach, drawing upon India's own political history and political experience, but also leveraging all our maritime agencies, their capacity, to provide security to the littoral states, which can be both in terms of the sheer presence of the Navy, but also sharing of the skills, with them. Whether it is through regional level exercises or it is through training of naval officers of the littoral countries, and I bring in the Coast Guard, and even to an extent where I can, even the coastal police. And in fact, I mentioned in my book that the Department of Ocean Affairs says that India is the only country in the littoral region which actually has an Institute of Oceanography. And it says that that is the capacity that we have. If we can share that capacity and help build these littoral countries, the capacity, you can understand as to how the situation can become much more stable. And the fact of the matter is, as I mentioned in my book, that instability is actually a threat multiplier. The lack of capacity, institutional capacity, actually aggravates challenges and threats. So I actually situate my entire inquiry in that context, and as to what should be the focus of our diplomatic endeavor. Now, coming to your question as to what the lead agency is, I think you're quite right. As I was mentioning to a good lady here during the coffee, over coffee, that I used to handle, when I was the Foreign Office, I used to handle the IORA, it was called IORA in those days. And I used to wonder, there's enough work for this organization where even the foreign ministers could get busy. But I recommend this book that because the strategic context has changed, it's changed because the strategic situation in the Indian Ocean region is undergoing a change. And if we want to steer it in a positive direction, which is in the interest of our national objective, and I would imagine global objective, perhaps international community objective, in that case, we need to take advantage of the position here. And for that, to upscale the capacity of Indian Ocean Rim Association, make it at the level of summit, have the heads of state meeting, where you have, and invite the dialogue partners if China has legitimate interest. In fact, Mr. Modi in his speech mentions that those countries which have outside, extra-regional countries, which have legitimate interest in the Indian Ocean, they can come and they should come. But if you create a dialogue structure, in that case, all the apprehensions, the anxieties that we have, those apprehensions and anxieties can be actually, in one way, they can be squared and they can be compromised. Once you have the position, and now our position actually is that the Indian Navy is strong enough at the moment, even if you compare the Chinese Navy as far as the Indian Ocean is concerned, and then the US Navy, and you have other great powers. So at this particular moment, the maritime order in the Indian Ocean actually is favorable to us. And therefore, it will require on the part of Chinese far greater effort, even if, let us say, you forget about their preoccupation in East China Sea or South China Sea. But it will require far greater effort on their part actually to do something or to disrupt this particular order. So the point actually is that because of the fact the strategic context is changing, this is the kind of a framework that I suggest. And therefore the interest, the fact that the Prime Minister went and articulated his vision as to what the Indian Ocean, what is our policy towards the Indian Ocean, I think is very timely. And therefore, you're quite right that there is stovepiping of various agencies, I think, and I suggest as to how they can be improved further. My point really is that, of course, it has to be led, it has to be foreign policy led kind of an approach, because that is where you bring in the totality of perspective. And in that perspective, you find better coordination. So I talk about capacity building, I talk about scenario building capacity, which you don't have, leveraging, involving various think tanks, intellectual resources, which we can bring into actually better kind of scenario building, so that you prepare yourself better. And and it's a kind of a situation where you bring in a kind of constant feedback loop. I mean, you are in a position where you can anticipate the development which might take place. You prepare yourself for that, and then you are in a position to do that. Coming to your second question on the plan and the quadrilateral issue, as you know that I think the present government has taken a fairly robust position on that. The two statements by Modi and Obama actually speak for themselves. I think there certainly is part of strategic signaling as far as we are concerned, and I think the Chinese are getting the message on that. And the fact that we bring India, Ocean and Pacific together in this construct means that India is also indicating to all concerned that we have interest in South China Sea as well. So that kind of a signaling and kind of it has strategic implications, and now we have, I think the exercises that we're talking about, the Malabar exercises, where the US and Japan are going to join, but we have now this the two sets of dialogues, India, US and Japan, and then I think India, Australia, and I forget, Japan, most probably.
Australia, Japan.
And Japan.
Singapore,
so just very briefly, just to conclude this point. So the point actually is that this is the part of the new robust diplomacy that the government is following. I think it's a good way for signaling purposes, and this signaling can be leveraged for making sure that the Indian Ocean remains. But that's one aspect. When you talk about China, we have other issues. So if this helps in a way in trying to, let us say, somewhat rebalance the equation with China, I think all that fits in that picture.
Thank you. In fact, I'll come back on this later on.
Okay.
But I suppose it also depends on what other countries, the quadrilateral exercise, the US, Japan, Australia, what their views are also on this. But let me now turn to the person who asked the first. Yes. Yes, please. If you could identify yourself, please.
Paul Gordon Wilson, fellow of the Waterhouse Services Institute and former Labour person. I think our chairman will back me up that about, 6 years ago, maybe we had the Chief of Defence Staff of the Indian Forces, who was an admiral, a very distinguished admiral, who had a very comprehensive breadth of naval power in a Mahanian sort of way, and actually very, very authoritative. He spoke then of having an interest in the Indian Navy into moving beyond the Malacca Straits into the South China Sea areas. And if we take that now to the present day, how do you still aspire to this? What are the problems are? You say your adherence is to UNCLOS, but the Chinese refuse to have anything to do with UNCLOS. You don't have a meeting of minds there. They have their string of pearls, naval bases in the Indian Ocean there, which are almost a potential threat, if not real, certainly undesirable. And so how would you address that? But also, you'll talk about cooperative maritime exercise in the Indian Ocean. I'm old enough to know the old middling series of exercise, which under the auspices of centre, because India wasn't belong, that was a non-aligned nation. But they had a very comprehensive exercises, and would you want to build on that at all? Is that too far back in history, and we're looking at totally new dimension of multilateral exercises?
Sorry, what last thing you said about what exercise?
Onto the multilateral nature exercise. I mean, do you want to move into a multilateral from there?
We actually have the Milan exercises in the Bay of Bengal. In one way, you can say this also India's Act East sort of phase. That we have the Milan group of exercises. I mentioned about that. I forget there are 29 and 30 navies which participate. They take part in exercise. They're mostly tabletop exercises. That's what I understand. They take part there, but they all come together, and therefore that's a good occasion for exchange of experience and that sort of thing. And many countries, Southeast Asia, Australia, Japan, all of the countries actually, Myanmar, all the countries come actually for that exercise. That exercise. We also have again, if you in my book I mention about the exercises that India has with various navies, bilateral exercises, and of course Malabar is with US, but now we are actually making it a kind of a multilateral exercise. Now, as far as India and South China Sea is concerned, I would actually say that in one way our situation in South China Sea is comparable to the Chinese situation in the Indian Ocean. We really don't have that capacity to alter the strategic balance of forces in South China Sea. That's not our capacity. But yes, we do indicate that we have a strategic interest in South China Sea, in the sense that they should not be the security situation should not deteriorate to an extent where there is no freedom of navigation, for example, because we have trade interests, we have diaspora in those areas, and our relations very close to these countries. So we actually want to make sure that we convey our message strongly and clearly, and if it means that you do it to show that you are, of course, we support the ASEAN position on this, but also if it shows that you appear, let's say the joint statement by Obama and Modi, it's also a signal that we, if required, we are in a position to let's say bolster a certain position as far as South China Sea is concerned. I would not say that we on our own can do anything of that kind, but yes, in partnership and this kind of a strategic leveraging, we certainly can make an impact. Now, you're right, the China is a signatory to UNCLOS, but they have joined UNCLOS with certain caveats. And South China Sea Islands is actually a very good example of that, 9-9, so on and so forth, they talk in my book. So ultimately it becomes a power play. I mean, if, let us say, with the US rebalancing, the pivot which is taking place, if China to an extent, let us say, realizes that they are checked somewhat, and if that helps, for example, in negotiating a better sort of code of conduct on South China Sea between the ASEAN and China, I think that would be a desirable and positive outcome. So in one way, I think it has that effect, but it is, of course, I mean, it's a daily news you read nowadays. It's every day you find some kind of confrontation building up. So whilst we are coming up in support of the ASEAN position on this, in my book, my aim also is to say that why we can make an effort to prevent, let's say, the spilling over of these kind of tensions in the Indian Ocean region. And I think we are in a better position because it's favorable to us, and at this particular moment, China doesn't have the capacity to challenge it.
Just to add...
I'm sorry, you talked about string of pearls.
Yes.
Now, my point actually, in my book, I mentioned that the strategic discourse which should take place in this, I say two things in this, where the debate can take place and should be steered, and Indian Navy can play an important role. Indian Ocean Naval Symposium and other think tanks, I talk about a lot of that. That, for example, you can develop CBMs about the passage through the straits, the passage, freedom of passage through the straits, so that the straits do not become choke points, and choke points in a sense which can be leveraged by one power against the other, like the Saudi Arabia has done in the case of Bab el-Mandab. So that's one issue I see. The other one is that we can actually, because of the fact we have anxiety about foreign bases in the Indian Ocean waters, we can perhaps develop some CBMs on that as well. So and therefore the string of pearls, we say, or we don't say it, but there is an expression, string of pearls. The Chinese call it Maritime Silk Road. So there are different aspects of the entire approach to the Chinese which actually are highlighted in this discourse. And that's something which can be managed through this discourse and other ways. Yeah.
Just to add, Ambassador, that just the Milan is Hindi. Milan is a gathering. It's a gathering of ships. It's not an exercise.
A friendly gathering, yeah.
Yeah, so it's not a multilateral exercise.
But they do tabletop exercise.
But because the context of multilateral exercise then is different, and the implications of that as opposed to Milan. Milan is very low key and
quite right. Yes.
Let me take Antoine. Yes, and then you, please. Yes.
Thank you, Rahul. Most of my points have actually been answered, I think. I suppose the remaining interrogation I'd have is related to the Maritime Silk Road, and whether you think it has a sort of a security shadow which is underpinning it specifically. This idea that trade comes in with a number of interests, and one of those is the protection of the actual trade route and the people who manage that trade route.
I think that's a good point, and as I said, I do talk about that to an extent in the book. The point about the Maritime Silk Road, as the Chinese sort of articulate that, is that they're talking about these ports and then the economic zones around those ports. They're doing it with the support and consent of the host government. So the Indonesians want it, the Sri Lankans want it, the Maldivians want it. What can anybody do about it? That's a simple question. And there is, of course, a security sort of, let's say, downside to it or upside to it from whichever side you look at. And therefore, that is one aspect which obviously worries various people. There are two aspects in this. As I said, that if you have a more robust discourse on maintaining the maritime order in the Indian Ocean, that is one issue which can be subsumed in that larger discourse. The other thing is that I have read, the Chinese, I do not know, maybe the China watchers can tell me better, but I think they seem to be shooting themselves in the foot. That if they are actually flexing their muscles in the South China Sea, and at the same time telling the Indonesians while they are going into Indonesian waters and disturbing sort of in a way, what should I say, provoking them, and then they go across and say, look, we are going to build these maritime Silk Road projects on your territory. I don't know how the Indonesians are going to take it. So in fact, I've read some Chinese comments saying that, look, you have to decide. You want to flex your muscles or you want to build the infrastructure, which countries will welcome, but you can't do both. So in one way, there is a contradiction in the Chinese position also in this. So my larger point actually is that in one way, if the countries want it, it's not in India's capacity to actually stop them from doing it, quite frankly. Hambantota, or other places that you pick up, Gwadar, for example. But if you can create that framework of discourse, and I give all the dimensions, aspects of it, if you create the framework of discourse, I'm sure all these aspects will come into it, because where there are security challenges, those security challenges will have to be addressed if these issues are to be picked, if let's say these kind of projects are to be gone through. Still a pie in the sky. It's a long way off, but the fact of the matter is that's why this is a time when we can generate the discourse.
And the gentleman, if you identify yourself, please.
It's Masato Kimura, Japanese freelancer.
Right.
My question is about South China Sea in detail. So I'm afraid China can stop for a while, but always try to creep forward. And Obama administration sent Russell within 12 miles within our artificial islands. What kind of parity do you expect in short term? So I think China never back down. And so second question is strategic nuclear submarine of China. And so some said China need a free sea or nuclear submarine because they need deterrence of nuclear against the US. How do you evaluate such kind of theory?
Such kind of?
Theory. So how do you evaluate a Chinese nuclear submarine in South China Sea?
No, I think I would not be able to give a definite answer to any of these because there's a fluid situation very clearly, but situation of tension, no doubt about it. As you can see it daily. I do talk in my book. Of course, there are. That's why I talk about UNCLOS. Basically, that UNCLOS does provide the basis on which a lot of these issues, even though they are not resolved, but you can still find the way, have the ground rules, so to say, to cooperate. Like for example, there are instances I quote in this book where, for example, I think it's Malaysia, Malaysia and Vietnam, that they make the respective territorial claims, but whilst they put the claims in abeyance, they are actually have a mechanism for joint exploitation of the oil resources there. So that's one aspect I bring up. The second one I bring up, of course, is that all these obviously maritime territorial disputes always arouse the most basic of nationalistic passions. So it behoves the national leaderships to calm those passions, because in these kind of aggravated or this aroused nationalistic passions, it becomes very difficult to discuss a dispute, because dispute actually means a compromise. You have to have a compromise if you want to stabilize the situation. So that's the other aspect I look at. The third aspect I do mention here is that perhaps, to the extent it's possible, one can develop all the capabilities, but technological research or whatever you're doing, but avoid deployment of the latest technologies. I make this point. I mean, obviously within the bounds of practicability, that where, I mean, you build your technological capability, but don't make forward deployments, because that actually is kind of it aggravates the situation considerably. And of course and of course the fact still remains that I mean, these tensions, I hope that they will not lead to any flashpoint or that kind of situation, but yes, I think they need to be managed. Sorry.
Okay, yes, Deepa Olapalli.
Yes.
Hi,
Hello.
Deepa here,
Yes.
George Washington University. Ambassador, my question relates in part to the rebalancing of the United States and also how the U.S. role in the Indian Ocean, how you view that, because some might say that the rebalancing in 2011 played some part in emboldening some of the smaller countries like Philippines to challenge China, and also that it may have provoked China in some sense to feel a bit more that it is being questioned in a way that was troublesome for it. So the U.S. clearly has its own agenda. The Indians have their own agenda in the Indian Ocean. So when you've mentioned the Indian naval exercise with the United States, the quadrilateral that Rahul mentioned, all of this. So there's some assumption, obviously, that the Indo-U.S. maritime minds are coming together. And then on the other hand, we're talking about creating a security discourse, strategic maritime discourse, that is very much India-led and, harking back to various earlier civilizational outlooks, very different from a geopolitical, strategic, competitive versus another kind of, where countries in the region, especially India and China, look at economic development. Where does your approach come into being able to sort of sort that out?
Well, I think that's a tricky question. Let me put it like this: that the U.S. pivot to the east, it feeds into this kind of an action-reaction process that is taking place. Very clearly, the U.S. has an agenda, and very clearly there is an element of distrust amongst the Southeast Asian countries and East Asian countries as to how the U.S. agenda actually squares with their own. I mean, for example, you would have read, I think the IIS's report, the annual report, last annual survey, where actually it says that the U.S., to the disappointment of the Chinese, the U.S. did not call for the revocation of the ADIZ, for example. But in a way, China contributed to it. I mean, after all, the U.S. moved into South China Sea, and basically South China Sea, because the ASEAN actually wanted them to come because of the fact that the Chinese were being very aggressive. The declaration on South China Sea was not being followed up as their commitment was with a negotiated code of conduct, and then this kind of an aggressive behavior on their part. So very clearly, it actually feeds in this kind of an action-reaction kind of situation. There's no doubt about that. You're right. So I think in one way, all the countries involved, including India, I mean, we are going with eyes open as to how the strategic picture is changing here. And perhaps we can leverage it from our point of view, because as I said, that if we look at it, I mean, all this fits into the larger picture, but if we see that Indian Ocean situation here gives an opening and an opportunity, I think let's exploit that, instead of becoming somewhat, following a kind of a passive sort of inert approach that, well, what's happening is inevitable, and the same thing will, sort of spill over into the Indian Ocean. The strategic discourse, as I said, the current maritime order is in India's favor, largely because of the convergence of Indian and US strategic interest at the moment, which wasn't the case during the Cold War, as you know. So the point is that if this is an opening for us, certainly the strategic discourse can be wide enough and broad enough to actually cover not only the hard security imperatives, which again is the core concern of any country, but also bring it in a larger holistic sense, where you say that you can provide stability in the region by building capacities, by stabilizing institutions, and not just the let's say the ocean waters, but literal states. I mean, what's happening in Yemen, what's happening in Iraq, what's happening in all the places around the littoral. So all of that, you can actually, to an extent, by enveloping that in your discourse and following the approach that I suggest, perhaps you can help.
The last two questions,
Okay.
one by Desmond, and then I'll ask the last question.
Okay.
So, Desmond,
Yes.
please.
Justin Byrne, I'm the IIIS member. I'm just picking up on this business of geopolitics of our last question. I'm thinking about a phrase that you use, which is maintaining the maritime order. I mean, to what extent is India prepared to engage in a substantive naval way, with others who border the Indian Ocean? I'm thinking about Arabs, I'm thinking about Africans, East Africa. I mean, dialogue and engagement in a broad way to have peaceful outcomes is all very well, but sometimes in terms of trade or environment or security, you actually need to have friends and allies that you can work with in a hard power way. I mean, to what extent is India kind of thinking about that as a future need?
Okay, I think India has been quite proactive in this, and I bring out that in the book, because the Indian Navy, and this is, of course, the government of India is actually sort of pushing for that, is to develop the capacity for what you call the maritime domain awareness. So you are building these kind of relationships with the littoral navies and having sort of installations from where actually you enlarge your domain awareness in the Indian Ocean region. So that's what's happening. And in any case, as I mentioned, the fact of the matter is that the Indian Navy is considered to be, by and large, benign. I say mostly considered benign. I know of some exceptions, but by and large considered benign. So the fact is that as a benign Navy, with a capacity, expanding capacity for domain awareness, I think that itself has a significant strategic impact on the situation in the Indian Ocean region. And then you can build in this issue that we have, for example, port calls, all kind of arrangement we have with various countries, the Gulf, in the Asian, the East African littoral, with Sri Lanka, with Maldives, with Myanmar. So that capacity actually is expanding and actually is building up from there.
Yeah. Let me just. Okay.
Just because I just want, because it's a specific question for Indian Navy. I'm serving Indian Navy officer. I'm posted there as a naval advisor. Since 2008, India has a ship in Gulf of Aden escorting all the ships in the anti-piracy program.
Correct.
And I myself was manning a destroyer and operated there for about 3 months. And we still have a ship. And like the last 3 years, we have found that there is no piracy incident which has now taken place anywhere in that region. And while we were not part of the CMF or the coalition force, we were actively engaged in the cooperation of fighting with piracy. I know 2 instances where I didn't take any orders back home when the involvement was between the 3 or 4 navies to attend to particular situation. And we have spotted, I think, by now about 4,000 ships or 5,000 ships which have gone without any kind. So these kind of things are happening more and more.
Also, naval visits.
Thanks.
Yeah.
Let me just end by asking the last question, which
Okay,
actually
sure.
relates to this.
Sure,
Is that
sure.
if you look around in the last few years, there are what I believe are three maritime strategic partners for India: the US, Japan, and Australia.
Mm-hmm.
I want to focus on the last country, on Australia,
Okay.
where the relationship has changed tremendously. Where in the mid-1980s, as you're aware, the expansion of the Indian Navy was criticized by Canberra on the basis that the rationale is not quite clear. Today, there's a U-turn in that, and we have, in fact, when Tony Abbott visited Delhi a couple of months ago, we had the joint statement of the naval exercises, etc. Can you give us a sense of where you see the India-Australia strategic relationship on maritime and other areas going?
Well, I think that's a good question again. I think Australian Navy's capabilities in the Indian Ocean region, Indian Ocean waters, I think that's something which we have to see to what extent it's growing. I mean, I don't think it's really at the moment a major strategic player as far as the Indian Ocean region is concerned. But we are certainly having quite a strong naval cooperation in terms of ships, exchange of ships, naval exercises we are now starting. We've done that earlier, but we're starting again. Also, I mean, people attending courses in each other's institutions, joint sort of studies on strategic issues that is being done, and of course in the Indian Ocean Naval Symposium, again you find that Australia is actually playing an important role at a conceptual level, how to develop, let's say, a more stable environment in the Indian Ocean, and how to build capacities. So I think that is how I see that happening. I doubt very much if Indian Navy will do joint exercises with the Australian Navy in the South China Sea. I'm not sure of that.
But in terms of Australia's leadership over IORA and IONS at the same time, India is comfortable with that?
Very much, because I mean, sir, our strategic interests are convergent in this. I mean, as you mentioned now.
Excellent. Thank you, Ambassador. We've run out of time, so I'd like to thank you very much for speaking on this issue. And as you can see, there are a lot of questions and a lot of interest. So. And we look forward very much to reading your book
and hopefully review this book also.
Yes, thank you.
I would request that once the book is read, it may be reviewed as well.
Of course, thank you very much. I'd like all of us to join in showing appreciation.